Sok. What if the first things you remember weren't lullabies, but screams? What if home didn't mean safety, but danger you had to navigate every day? Long before the world knew his name, before the wealth, the books, the Hollywood movie, Chris Gardner was just a frightened boy, trying to survive in a world of fists, hunger, and silence. Now. Chris Gardner wasn't born into wealth, nor did he have a peaceful childhood like many other kids. He was born in 1954 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a gritty industrial city in the American Midwest. From a very young age, Chris's life was marked by trauma, poverty, and a broken family. His mother, Betty Jean, was a strong woman who struggled to raise her children alone, while his biological father was completely absent from the picture. Chris's childhood was filled with fear and insecurity. He grew up in a household where violence was a daily occurrence. His stepfather, an alcoholic and a controlling man, frequently beat both his mother and the children. Chris often witnessed his mother being beaten until she collapsed, and he himself was no stranger to physical abuse. But perhaps the most painful part was the helplessness, the inability to protect the woman he loved most. Despite the hardship, it was Chris's mother who planted the first seeds of resilience and ambition in him. She would often whisper to him, "You can be anything you want to be, as long as you believe in it and never give up." While others might have seen him as just another poor black kid with no father and no future, his mother was the one person who saw potential in him. Yet those encouraging words didn't make life any easier. In his teenage years, Chris's mother was sent to prison on a minor charge tied to a complex family situation. During that time, Chris was placed in foster care and children's shelters. He was separated from his siblings, living in loneliness and feeling abandoned. But instead of giving in, Chris learned to observe, to adapt, and most importantly, to keep the fire within him alive. One of the small miracles of Chris Gardner's stormy childhood was his love for learning. Even without access to a proper education, he was always curious, always asking questions. He spent hours at the public library, reading everything he could: biology, history, and stories of successful people. In the heart of that poor black boy, a vague dream was beginning to take shape, a dream of a different life, where he wouldn't be beaten, wouldn't go hungry, and wouldn't have to watch his mother suffer from betrayal and pain. As he grew older, Chris temporarily put aside his dream of becoming a doctor, as he lacked the financial means to attend medical school. Instead, he joined the U.S. Navy and served at a medical research facility in North Carolina. There, he had the opportunity to work alongside doctors and develop key skills in communication, discipline, and hard work. Though he didn't become a physician, the experience shaped him into a man with structure, purpose, and a drive to overcome challenges. After leaving the military, Chris Gardner got married and moved to San Francisco, California. He worked various jobs to make ends meet, from selling medical equipment to working as a security guard and a mover. But deep down, he always felt a void, a sense that he was meant for something greater. Then one day, while working as a medical equipment salesman, he had a life-changing encounter. A man stepped out of a shiny red Ferrari, and when Chris asked what he did for a living, the man replied, "I'm a stockbroker." That moment was the first major turning point in Chris Gardner's life. He realized this could be the way out of poverty. No expensive degrees, no massive startup capital, just skill, instinct, and an unbreakable will. He began studying the stock market, applying to brokerage firms, and was even willing to work unpaid just to get a chance at training. But the road ahead would be far from easy. In fact, it would soon lead him into a period darker than his childhood. He would lose his home, his marriage, and end up homeless with his young son. Yet it was those turbulent early years that forged Chris Gardner's iron spirit. He knew what it meant to go without, to be rejected, to be looked down upon. And he also knew, if he could survive all of that, there was nothing he couldn't overcome. In his early 20s, Chris Gardner entered one of the most decisive but also darkest chapters of his life. It was the moment he bet everything on one big dream: to become a stockbroker. At the time, Chris was living in San Francisco with his wife and young son. He worked as a medical equipment salesman, a job that was unstable but just enough to support the family. Still, he felt deeply dissatisfied with a life that was uncertain and seemed to offer no future. Every day, Chris knocked on doors of clinics and hospitals, trying to pitch a product that most doctors didn't even want. Some days, he walked miles and miles, only to receive a few rejections and a promise of delayed payment. Then one day, a random moment changed everything. As he was pulling his car out of a parking lot, Chris saw a man step out of a bright red Ferrari. The car was gleaming, so eye-catching that Chris couldn't take his eyes off it. Intrigued by the man's confident, successful appearance, Chris boldly walked up and asked, "Excuse me, what do you do for a living?" The man smiled and replied, "I'm a stockbroker." It was the first time Chris had ever heard of the profession, but it immediately lit a spark in him. If he can do it, why can't I? He thought. Chris began researching the financial markets, learning about investing, and identifying the major brokerage firms operating in San Francisco. He applied to dozens of companies, willing to join any training program, even if it was unpaid. Eventually, he was invited to a trainee internship at Dean Witter Reynolds, one of the biggest brokerage firms at the time. But the joy was short-lived. Storms were coming. Chris's wife, already frustrated with their unstable life, decided to leave him. She took everything except their young son, Christopher Jr., whom she left behind. Suddenly, Chris was a single father with no home, no income, and no support. And that's when the darkest days of Chris Gardner's life began. During the day, he would wake up early, drop his son off at a public daycare, and rush to catch the train to his internship. While other interns could fully focus on learning, Chris had to study, cold call potential clients, and constantly worry about where he and his son would sleep that night. With no money for rent, Chris and his son lived night to night. Some nights, they slept on park benches. Other nights, they curled up in train stations. But perhaps the most heartbreaking moment came when Chris had to take his son into a public restroom at a subway station, lock the door, and pretend they were playing Cave Adventure just to keep his son from being scared. Chris sat on the toilet, holding his son close, tears silently falling as he listened to people knocking from outside. Those knocks weren't just sounds, they were symbols of shame, powerlessness, and a father desperately trying to protect his child at all costs. And yet, he never let his son feel unloved. Even with only a few coins in his pocket, he'd buy a small sandwich to share. Even without a warm bed, he told bedtime stories. And even though life was cruel, Chris kept a promise to himself. He would never abandon his son, the way his own father had abandoned him. The weight on the shoulders of that 28-year-old man grew heavier every day. But instead of giving up, Chris Gardner turned that pressure into fuel. He knew if he quit, his son would have no future. If he accepted his fate, he would forever be just another homeless black man. So Chris threw himself into his training with unmatched determination. He memorized stock codes, charts, and complex financial terms. He practiced sales calls, honed his confidence, and learned to pitch like a pro. While other interns went home to rest, he walked miles to pick up his son and find shelter for the night. There was no time to complain, only time to act. Still, the days were long and hard. Some mornings he had to choose between buying milk for his son or catching the train to work. There were days he was yelled at, over the phone, rejected over and over, but he kept calling. Once he was late to a meeting because he couldn't find someone to watch his son and got harshly scolded, but he swallowed it. Because he knew this was his only shot, and even if the door was just slightly open, it was worth everything. One of the most inspiring things about Chris Gardner was that he never used his circumstances as an excuse. Even when he was homeless, he dressed neatly, stayed professional, and never complained or asked for pity. In fact, many of his coworkers didn't even know he was living in a public restroom. All they saw was a man who was driven, sharp, hardworking, and desperately hungry for success. Chris Gardner lived like that for nearly a year, 12 months with no home, no paycheck, no support, just faith, grit, and unconditional love for his son. For many, this would be the end, a point of surrender. But for Chris, it was only a test. And after all the effort, the pain, and the sacrifice, he was finally rewarded. Chris was one of the few trainees offered a full-time position at Dean Witter, beating out hundreds of other interns. His life was about to change. But that is a story for the next chapter. Each morning, as San Francisco lay quietly beneath a blanket of cold mist, Chris Gardner was already up. Not to begin an ordinary day, but to wage war. Not a war of weapons, but a relentless battle for survival, for dignity, and for the well-being of his son. Though homeless and burdened by hardship, Chris never walked away from the demanding training program at Dean Witter Reynolds. Day after day, he showed up in clean clothes, clutching an empty briefcase containing little more than a few notes, a pen, and the fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow could hold something better. There was no paycheck, no benefits, no certainty. Still, Chris arrived each morning on time, composed and professional, with the posture of a man who had it all. What his colleagues didn't know was that when the office lights dimmed, he wasn't heading home, but beginning a nightly search for a place to sleep with his son. Some evenings, they waited in long lines outside homeless shelters. If they were late or the shelter was full, they'd return to the park or find refuge on a bench at the train station. On the worst nights, they'd hide inside a public restroom, lock the door, and turn the space into an imaginary cave, so the child wouldn't be afraid. There, in the cold and the dark, Chris held his son close, wrapping his arms around him to block the chill. Tears fell in silence as fists pounded the restroom door. Not just knocks, but echoes of judgment, pressure, and the heavy weight of being unseen and unheard. Yet no matter how hard things became, Chris never let his son feel fear. He still told bedtime stories. He still whispered goodnight. He still hugged his child tightly, shielding him not only from the cold, but from the truth. In young Christopher Jr.'s eyes, his father wasn't a man lost to misfortune. He was a protector, a constant, a hero. And maybe that was Chris Gardner's quiet superpower, refusing to be defined by despair, refusing to let struggle strip away his son's sense of safety, and above all, choosing, again and again, to be the father he had once needed himself. Within the sleek, high-rise walls of Dean Witter Reynolds, the sound of ringing phones echoed endlessly. Pages turned, footsteps moved quickly, and tension filled the air like static. Yet at one desk, Chris Gardner worked with unwavering concentration. Every phone call he made, every pitch he gave, was more than just a business move. It was his fight to stay afloat. While colleagues laughed in the break room or strolled casually between meetings, Chris remained glued to his phone. He dialed non-stop, line after line, as though every ring brought him 1 inch closer to survival. Time wasn't something he could waste. Each second had to produce results. He knew he couldn't afford to be average. If he wasn't among the best, he'd be gone. And if he was gone, so was any chance at a better future. Lunch breaks were a luxury he didn't take. Instead, he munched on stale crackers from the vending machine while poring over lists of leads. He memorized phone numbers and practiced introducing himself. He refined his tone, sharpened his timing. Tired as he was, he never let it show in his voice. A no never stopped him. It simply meant he was closer to a yes. One day, Chris reached out to a prospect who was clearly uninterested. The man's voice was clipped, impatient. But Chris didn't hang up. He asked how the man's day had been. He made a passing comment about the economy. He listened closely, then responded thoughtfully. And before long, the man agreed to a meeting. That conversation, almost lost in the first few seconds, would become the turning point of Chris's internship. This was Chris's method. No complaining, no delays. Every rejection taught him something. Every closed door became fuel for the next knock. When the office emptied at dusk, Chris stayed behind. He studied financial reports, practiced cold calls, and fine-tuned his delivery. Fatigue clung to him, but he never let it show. His energy came not from rest, but from resolve. He didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. He only needed to be the one who refused to give up. Because Chris wasn't chasing a promotion. He was chasing freedom. The list was finally posted. 6 long months of exhaustion, silence, missed meals, and quiet tears had all led to this moment. Chris Gardner stood among the other interns, heart pounding as eyes scanned the paper pinned to the board. Row by row, name by name. There it was. His. He didn't cheer. He didn't cry. Not right away. He simply stood still, absorbing the weight of it. Chris Gardner, homeless father, unpaid intern, the man who had once slept on a restroom floor with his son, had been chosen. He stepped outside the building into the golden light of late afternoon. The street buzzed with life. cars honking, footsteps rushing by, but for a brief moment, everything was quiet inside him. Chris looked up at the sky, eyes brimming but not yet spilling. A slow, shaky smile crossed his face. He didn't need to say anything. He had made it. Soon after, he and Christopher Jr. moved into a small apartment. It wasn't grand, but it had 4 walls, a door that locked, and a place for his son to lay his head without fear. For the first time in a long time, they had a home. Chris's journey in the financial world was only just beginning. From that first official paycheck, he started to climb, not by shortcuts or favors, but by relentless hard work. Every deal he closed, every relationship he built, was earned through grit and honesty. In time, he would go on to found his own brokerage firm. He would become a millionaire. But more than that, he became a man his son could always look up to. Years later, when asked how he survived the worst moments, Chris never spoke about luck. He never gave grand speeches. He only said, "I kept going," because stopping wasn't an option. Chris Gardner's story reminds us that triumph isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet moment, a deep breath on the sidewalk, a father holding his son's hand, a man deciding not to give up one more day. And that, more than anything, is what it means to win. When Chris Gardner was finally offered a full-time position at Dean Witter Reynolds, he didn't cheer or jump for joy. He simply exhaled, a long, quiet breath of relief. After months of uncertainty, nights spent in shelters, and days pretending everything was fine when it wasn't, he had finally secured something solid beneath his feet. But the reality of the job wasn't glamorous. The world of stockbroking was cutthroat, fast-paced, and relentless. Every call was a chance, or a risk, worth thousands of dollars. Pressure came from all sides: aggressive clients, internal quotas, and a swarm of equally hungry colleagues. Chris, the man who used to count coins to buy food, was now working in a place where money wasn't just a goal. It was the very air they breathed. Fortunately, he didn't come unprepared. His months as an unpaid intern had sharpened his instincts. He had trained himself to speak with precision, confidence, and warmth. He had learned how to work twice as fast, absorb market trends like a sponge, and keep pushing even when sleep-deprived. Now, with a proper desk, his own phone line, and a modest client list, he was ready. Chris arrived early every morning and often stayed long after others left. While coworkers paused for lunch or chatted about sports, he kept dialing. Crackers from the vending machine were his meal. His notes were meticulous. He remembered everything: what time a client liked to talk, what industries they were watching, even the names of their children. For Chris, every call was personal. One day, he called a notoriously difficult investor, someone known to hang up within seconds. But Chris didn't launch into a pitch. He asked the man about his day. He joked about the wild swings in the market. He listened. And slowly, the tone on the other end shifted. That call led to a meeting. That meeting led to a deal. And that deal became one of Chris's earliest real breakthroughs. He never saw rejection as defeat. No just meant not yet. Every failed call was a brick in the road forward. In time, Chris's efforts didn't go unnoticed. He stood out, not because he was loud or flashy, but because he was dependable, honest, relentless. He never oversold. He never disappeared when the market dipped. Clients remembered his voice, his calm, his presence. Soon, Chris Gardner, the man who once had no address, no degree, and no connections, climbed to the top ranks of the firm. He didn't just catch up with the elite, he outran them. After rising to the top ranks of the brokerage world, Chris Gardner took the next bold step. He founded his own firm, Gardner Rich & Co. There were no gleaming office towers or high-powered investors behind him. Just a second-hand desk, a landline phone, and an unbreakable belief in what he could build. With $10,000 to his name, he began again, but this time on his own terms. What set this beginning apart was what he brought with him: a reputation earned through relentless hard work, unwavering honesty, and deep respect for every client he had ever served. For Chris, money was never the destination. It was the means to create value, integrity, and lasting impact. Instead of spending money to flaunt his newfound success, he poured it into people. He offered jobs to young, overlooked individuals, those without diplomas or connections, but bursting with potential. He built a workplace grounded in compassion like opportunity and merit. At Gardner Rich, your worth was not defined by your past, but by how you showed up today. Then in 2006, his story reached a turning point. Chris published his memoir, The Pursuit of Happyness. It wasn't polished for effect. It was raw, truthful, and deeply human, chronicling nights spent in subway bathrooms, days with empty pockets, and a journey fueled not by luck, but by grit and unrelenting faith. The book spoke with quiet power, and the world listened. Hollywood followed. Will Smith stepped into Chris's shoes to bring his story to the screen. The film, also titled The Pursuit of Happyness, premiered in 2006 and instantly resonated across cultures and generations. It wasn't just the story of a homeless father chasing a dream. It became a symbol of how far hope can carry us. At the premiere, the real Chris Gardner walked on stage beside his son. The audience stood, applause thundered, and though he didn't cry, his eyes shone with everything he had lived through. From that day forward, Chris became more than an entrepreneur. He became a messenger of resilience, a speaker, a mentor, a force for change. He traveled from city halls to classrooms, from shelters to stadiums, sharing his journey with those who had been forgotten, judged, or left behind. His message was clear: you can begin again. No matter how far you've fallen, no matter how lost you feel, your story isn't over. Chris went on to establish scholarships, support vocational training, and create career paths for young people with no roadmap. He believed that the quickest way to lift a life was to offer a real opportunity, and he proved it over and over again. Today, Chris Gardner is retired. His days are quieter, filled with family, travel, and reflection, but his voice still echoes. His story still travels. Because beyond wealth, beyond recognition, the greatest thing Chris left behind is a legacy of courage, humility, and a deep, unwavering belief in the human capacity to rise. When Chris Gardner stands before hundreds of eager students at a university auditorium, he often starts with a simple question. Has anyone here ever felt like they weren't good enough, smart enough, or lucky enough to make it? Dozens of hands rise. He smiles, a calm, certain smile. Good, he replies, because I used to believe that too, and I'm here to tell you, you're wrong. He doesn't lecture about success formulas or list accomplishments. Instead, he shares truth, nights spent sleeping in public bathrooms with his son, days when he had only spare change in his pocket, and the long stretch of time when no one believed in him but himself. But his message isn't just for classrooms filled with bright futures. It's for those who feel left behind. In a rehab center in New York, Chris sat with young men just released from prison, some guilty of theft, others of violence, some of drug trafficking. Each one convinced their lives had no way forward. Chris offered no slogans. He told them who he was, once homeless, once shoeless, once overlooked by everyone but himself. Then he asked, how many of you have ever been told no? Every hand lifted. How many of you think you're beyond forgiveness? Every hand stayed up. Then he said quietly, you don't need the world's forgiveness. You need to forgive yourself and begin again. Silence followed, not out of fear, but recognition. For the first time, someone stood before them not as a preacher, but as proof. Chris also goes to underfunded schools in rough neighborhoods where kids face drugs, violence, and indifference. He tells them about being beaten by a stepfather, about nights spent in fear, about growing up without anyone to look up to. And then, eyes steady, he says, I decided to become the role model I never had, and you can do the same. For Chris Gardner, being an inspiration isn't about spotlight moments. It's about lighting the way for those who've never been told they could shine. Chris Gardner's journey of inspiration went far beyond delivering motivational speeches. One of his most meaningful actions was returning to the very places that had once represented his darkest moments. Years after escaping homelessness, he walked back into the same shelter where he and his son had once spent nights curled up on the floor. But this time, he wasn't there to ask for help. He returned with purpose, to provide dinner for everyone staying there that night. He fed hundreds. Yet more than meals, Chris offered presence. He sat down with people, listened without judgment, asked what they needed, not as a guest of honor, but as someone who had lived their struggle. For many, it was the first time in years they felt seen with dignity instead of pity. Chris also made it a mission to visit schools in the most underserved neighborhoods, places where children grow up amid violence, neglect, and despair. He spoke candidly about his own past, the fear he lived with, the abuse he endured from a stepfather, and the lack of any role model. Then he met their eyes and said, "You don't have to wait for someone else to believe in you. You can believe in yourself right now. I did, and that's what got me through." Chris's impact reached far beyond inspirational words. He established charities, scholarship funds, and job training programs aimed at helping those society often overlooks. One of his most well-known initiatives was Start From Where You Are, a campaign built on the belief that you don't need a perfect beginning to begin. He lived by the idea, you don't wait for life to be ideal, you act, and that's what makes life change. In an emotional television interview, the host asked, "What keeps you going, even now after all your success?" Chris paused before answering, "Because somewhere tonight, a boy is sleeping under a staircase. A single mother is wondering how she'll feed her child tomorrow. I've been both. I can't turn away." That moment moved millions, not just because of the words, but because of the truth behind them. Success isn't meant to be kept. It's meant to be shared. Today, Chris Gardner is recognized not just in financial circles, but around the world as a humanitarian. He's spoken at the United Nations, TEDx events, Harvard University, and countless nonprofit organizations. When people ask him what his proudest achievement is, he doesn't talk about wealth, recognition, or even the film based on his life. He says simply, "Being the kind of father my son can be proud of, becoming the light I once searched for in the dark." His story is no fairy tale. It's proof of what's possible when someone chooses to rise, not once, but every single time they fall, and in doing so becomes a light for those still trying to find their way.